Sarah Jenkins stood at her bedroom window, watching the moving truck pull away from the house next door. At 18, she had learned to expect goodbyes, but this one felt different. The Modoc reservation had been her home for barely 6 months. Yet it already felt more stable than anywhere she had lived before. Her social worker, Mrs. Patterson, had explained that this would be her final placement. At 18, the system was done with her. The foster family that had taken her in, the Crowfeathers, were kind people who ran a small ranch on the reservation. They had offered to let her stay while she figured out her next steps, but Sarah knew she couldn't impose forever. The sound of a pickup truck pulling into the gravel driveway caught her attention. James Crowfeather stepped out, his weathered hands carrying grocery bags. At 35, he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent his life working the land. His 2 young children, Emma and Michael, ages 7 and 9, rushed out to help him. Sarah had noticed how gentle James was with his children, how he never raised his voice even when they tracked mud through the house or forgot their chores. It was a stark contrast to many of the homes she had lived in over the years. His wife, Linda, had passed away 2 years earlier from cancer, leaving him to raise the children alone while managing the ranch. During dinner that evening, James mentioned that he had been thinking about getting some help around the ranch. The work was getting harder to manage alone, especially with the children needing more attention as they grew older. Sarah had been helping out since she arrived, learning to feed the horses and mend fences. She had a natural way with the animals that impressed James. The conversation turned to Sarah's plans. She admitted she had been accepted to a community college 2 hours away, but had no way to pay for housing or even transportation. Her savings from part-time work at the local diner would barely cover books and supplies. The weight of uncertainty hung heavy in the air. James cleared his throat and made an offer that surprised everyone at the table. He suggested that Sarah could stay on the ranch permanently, helping with the work and the children in exchange for room and board. He could even pay her a small salary that would help with college expenses if she decided to commute. Emma and Michael immediately began chattering excitedly about Sarah staying. They had grown attached to her gentle presence and the way she helped them with homework without making them feel stupid. Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest that she had rarely experienced. For the first time in years, someone wanted her to stay. That night, Sarah lay in bed staring at the ceiling, processing the offer. She had learned not to get too comfortable anywhere, knowing that change was always around the corner. But something about this felt different. James had looked her in the eye when he made the offer, and she had seen sincerity there, not pity. The next morning, Sarah found James repairing a fence post near the creek that ran through the property. She approached nervously, having made her decision during the sleepless night. She told him she would like to accept his offer, and he smiled in a way that made her feel like she was making the right choice. Over the following weeks, Sarah settled into a routine that felt more like family life than anything she had experienced. She helped James with the ranch work, learning about cattle management and crop rotation. In the evenings, she assisted Emma and Michael with their homework and helped prepare dinner. The reservation community was close-knit, and news of James taking in the foster girl spread quickly. Most people were supportive, understanding the traditional Native American value of caring for those in need. However, Sarah noticed some whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, and a few pointed looks from some of the older women in town. Mrs. Deloria, who ran the general store, was particularly cold towards Sarah. During one shopping trip, she made a comment about young girls who didn't know their place and the trouble they could cause for grieving widowers. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and confusion, not understanding what she had done wrong. James seemed oblivious to the gossip, focused on his work and his children. But Sarah began to notice small things that made her wonder about the whispers. The way he sometimes looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. How he found excuses to brush past her in the kitchen. The lingering touches when he helped her with ranch work. At first, Sarah dismissed these observations as her own imagination. She had learned to be hypervigilant in foster homes, always watching for signs of danger or unwelcome attention. Maybe she was just being paranoid. James had been nothing but respectful and kind, treating her more like a daughter than anything else. But as autumn settled over the ranch, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting in the household dynamic. James seemed more attentive to her appearance, complimenting her hair or clothes in ways that made her uncomfortable. He began asking more personal questions about her past relationships and experiences. The children remained oblivious to any tension, happy to have Sarah as part of their daily lives. Emma had started calling her big sister, and Michael sought her out for help with his math homework every evening. Their innocent affection made Sarah even more determined to stay and provide them with stability. One evening in late October, James suggested they all go to the tribal harvest festival together. It would be Sarah's first time attending such an event, and she was excited to learn more about the community's traditions. James spent extra time getting ready, wearing his best shirt and the turquoise bolo tie that had belonged to his grandfather. At the festival, Sarah noticed how James introduced her to people. He didn't call her a foster child or helper, but simply Sarah, often with his hand resting on her shoulder in a way that felt more possessive than protective. Several people gave them curious looks, and Sarah began to understand some of the whispered conversations she had overheard. The evening ended with traditional dancing around a bonfire. James asked Sarah to dance, and she couldn't refuse without seeming rude. As they moved to the rhythm of the drums, she felt his hands holding her closer than necessary. When the dance ended, he whispered something about how beautiful she looked in the firelight. That night, Sarah lay awake again, but this time with a growing sense of unease. She was beginning to understand that James might have motives beyond simple kindness for asking her to stay. The realization made her stomach turn, but she also felt trapped. Where could she go? She had no money, no family, and no other options. The next morning brought the first snow of the season, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as James taught the children how to build a snowman. In that moment, he looked like the caring father she had first met, and she wondered if she was imagining problems that didn't exist. Maybe she was just being ungrateful for the first real home she had ever known. Winter arrived early that year, trapping everyone inside the ranch house for days at a time. The isolation that had once felt peaceful now seemed to press in on Sarah from all sides. With the children home from school due to a blizzard, the house felt smaller, and James's attention more focused. Sarah threw herself into household tasks, trying to stay busy and useful. She cooked elaborate meals, organized closets, and helped Emma and Michael with art projects that covered the kitchen table. But she couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, studied, evaluated in ways that made her skin crawl. James had started bringing her small gifts from his trips to town. A scarf in her favorite color, a book he thought she might enjoy, chocolate bars that he said reminded him of her. Each gift came with a smile and a comment about how he wanted to take care of her, how she deserved nice things after everything she had been through. The gifts made Sarah uncomfortable, but she didn't know how to refuse them without seeming ungrateful. When she tried to explain that he didn't need to buy her things, James would brush off her concerns and say that it made him happy to see her smile. The children thought it was sweet that their father was being so thoughtful. One snowy evening, while the children were watching a movie in the living room, James cornered Sarah in the kitchen while she was washing dishes. He stood closer than necessary, his body blocking her path to the door. He talked about how lonely he had been since Linda died, how difficult it was to raise children alone, how grateful he was that Sarah had come into their lives. Sarah kept her eyes focused on the soapy water, mumbling appropriate responses while her heart raced. When James reached around her to grab a dish towel, his chest pressed against her back for a moment longer than necessary. She could feel his breath on her neck as he whispered about how mature she was for her age, how she understood things that other young women couldn't. The spell was broken when Michael called from the living room asking for popcorn. James stepped back immediately, his demeanor shifting back to the friendly father figure Sarah had first met. The quick transformation was almost more unsettling than the inappropriate behavior, showing her how carefully he could control his public image. That night, Sarah made a decision. She needed to find a way to leave the ranch, even if it meant starting over with nothing. The problem was that winter had closed most of the roads and she had no car or money for bus fare. She was effectively trapped until spring, which felt like a lifetime away. Sarah began to research options online during the quiet hours when everyone else was asleep. She looked into scholarships, job opportunities in distant cities, anything that could provide her with an escape route. But every path seemed to require resources she didn't have or connections she had never been able to build. Meanwhile, the gossip in town was growing louder. Mrs. Deloria had started making pointed comments about young women who took advantage of grieving men. Other community members began treating Sarah with suspicion. as if she were somehow responsible for any inappropriate behavior, rather than being its victim. The isolation was taking its toll on James as well, but in ways that made Sarah's situation more dangerous. He became more possessive, questioning her about where she went during her rare trips to town and who she talked to. He started making comments about how other people didn't understand their family dynamic, how outsiders were jealous of what they had built together. During a particularly bad storm, the power went out for 3 days. The family huddled together in the living room near the wood stove, playing board games and telling stories by candlelight. It should have been cozy and family-like, but Sarah felt trapped and vulnerable in the flickering darkness. On the second night, James suggested that they all sleep in the living room near the fire for warmth. Sarah watched in horror as he arranged the sleeping bag so that hers was directly next to his, with the children on the far side of the room. She lay awake all night, hyper-aware of his presence beside her and the way he seemed to find excuses to touch her arm or shoulder. The next morning, Sarah overheard James on the phone with his brother, who lived in the next county. The conversation was about Sarah, and James was clearly lying about their relationship. He described her as being very mature for her age and practically a grown woman who was helping him heal from his grief. The implications in his tone made Sarah feel sick. When the power was restored, Sarah tried to call her former social worker, Mrs. Patterson, but the woman's response was disappointing and frustrating. At 18, Sarah was legally an adult and no longer under state protection. Unless James had actually assaulted her, there wasn't much anyone could do. Mrs. Patterson suggested that Sarah was lucky to have found such a stable living situation, and maybe she was misinterpreting friendly gestures. The conversation left Sarah feeling more alone than ever. The system that had moved her from home to home for years was now washing its hands of her completely. She was on her own, just like she had always feared she would be. Back at the ranch, James seemed to sense Sarah's growing discomfort and began to escalate his behavior. He started insisting on driving her to her job at the diner, claiming it was for her safety on the icy roads. But Sarah suspected it was really to monitor her interactions with other people and ensure she didn't confide in anyone about what was happening at home. During these car rides, James would talk about their future together. He painted pictures of Sarah staying on the ranch permanently, maybe even helping him expand the operation. He talked about how the children loved her and needed a mother figure, how perfect their little family was becoming. The way he said "our family" made Sarah's stomach turn. One afternoon, while cleaning James's bedroom, Sarah discovered something that changed everything. Hidden in his dresser drawer, beneath old photographs of his late wife, she found a collection of pictures he had taken of her without her knowledge. Photos of her working in the barn, cooking in the kitchen, even sleeping on the couch during a movie night with the children. The discovery confirmed her worst fears about James's intentions. These weren't innocent snapshots of family life. They were the obsessive documentation of someone who had developed an unhealthy fixation. The careful angles and intimate nature of some of the photos made it clear that James had been planning this for longer than she had realized. Sarah carefully put everything back where she found it, her hands shaking as she tried to process what she had discovered. She needed to get away from the ranch, but now she also needed to be incredibly careful about how she did it. If James was capable of this level of deception and obsession, there was no telling how he might react to her trying to leave. That evening, Sarah watched James interact with his children at dinner, seeing him through completely different eyes. He was still the gentle, caring father they knew and loved. But she now understood that he was also capable of maintaining a facade while pursuing his own disturbing agenda. The duality made her question everything she thought she knew about reading people and situations. As winter deepened and the snow continued to fall, Sarah felt like she was living in a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. Every day brought new challenges to her safety and sanity, while the outside world remained oblivious to her growing desperation. She knew she had to find a way out, but the path to freedom seemed more impossible than ever. Spring arrived like a prayer answered, melting the snow and opening the roads that had kept Sarah trapped for months. But with the changing season came new pressures from James, who seemed to interpret the warmer weather as an opportunity to advance his inappropriate relationship with her. Sarah had spent the winter months carefully documenting every uncomfortable interaction, writing details in a journal she kept hidden in her pillowcase. She recorded dates, times, and exact words, hoping that someday the evidence might help her if she needed to prove what was happening. The journal had become both her lifeline and her burden. The children's spring break from school created a new dynamic in the house. Emma and Michael were home all day, which provided Sarah with some protection from James's advances, but also made her more aware of how her departure would affect them. They had grown attached to her, and she genuinely cared about their well-being in what was becoming an increasingly unstable situation. During a trip to town for supplies, Sarah encountered Maria Santos, a teacher from the reservation school who had always been kind to her. Maria noticed something different about Sarah's demeanor and invited her for coffee at the small cafe next to the general store. For the first time in months, Sarah found herself alone with someone who seemed to genuinely care about her welfare. Maria was a perceptive woman who had worked with troubled youth for over a decade. She had noticed the gossip surrounding James and Sarah, but unlike others in the community, she was concerned about Sarah's well-being rather than judgmental about her perceived role in the situation. When Maria gently asked how things were going at the ranch, Sarah broke down and told her everything. The conversation was both a relief and a terrifying vulnerability for Sarah. Maria listened without judgment, asking clarifying questions and taking Sarah's concerns seriously. She explained that what James was doing constituted sexual harassment at minimum and potentially grooming behavior that could escalate to assault. More importantly, she offered practical help. Maria had connections with a women's shelter in the state capital about 4 hours away. The shelter had programs for young women aging out of the foster system, including job training and housing assistance. Maria offered to make some calls and see what resources might be available, but she warned Sarah that leaving would need to be planned carefully for her own safety. That evening, Sarah returned to the ranch with a mixture of hope and terror. For the first time in months, she had a potential path forward, but she also understood the risks involved in trying to escape. James had become increasingly possessive and controlling, and she feared how he might react to discovering her plans. James seemed to sense that something had changed during Sarah's trip to town. He questioned her extensively about who she had talked to and what she had discussed. When she mentioned having coffee with Maria, his expression darkened, and he made several disparaging comments about teachers who didn't understand family dynamics. Over the next few days, James's behavior became more erratic and aggressive. He started checking Sarah's phone and monitoring her internet usage. He made comments about how ungrateful some people could be after everything had been done for them. The veiled threats were becoming less veiled, and Sarah realized that her window for escape might be closing rapidly. The situation came to a head during a community barbecue at the tribal center. James had insisted that Sarah accompany the family, and he spent the entire event hovering near her, interrupting her conversations with other people and steering her away from anyone who might offer her support or advice. His possessive behavior was becoming obvious to other community members. Mrs. Deloria approached Sarah near the dessert table, but instead of her usual hostile comments, she seemed genuinely concerned. She quietly told Sarah that several people had noticed James's inappropriate behavior and were worried about her safety. Mrs. Deloria admitted that she had initially blamed Sarah for the situation, but she had come to understand that a young woman with no family or resources was in a vulnerable position. The unexpected support from Mrs. Deloria was both encouraging and frightening. If the community was starting to see James's behavior as problematic, it meant Sarah's situation was becoming more visible and urgent. But it also meant that James might feel pressured to take more drastic action to maintain control over the narrative. That night, James's mask slipped completely. After the children were asleep, he cornered Sarah in the kitchen again, but this time his approach was more aggressive and direct. He told her that he had been patient with her, giving her time to adjust to their new relationship, but that he expected her to start showing more appreciation for everything he had done for her. When Sarah tried to step away from him, James grabbed her wrist and pulled her closer. He told her that she belonged to him now, that she had nowhere else to go, and that fighting against their connection would only make things harder for everyone, especially the children. The threat against Emma and Michael was clear, and it terrified Sarah more than anything he had said about her own situation. Sarah managed to pull away and fled to her room, locking the door behind her. She spent the night sitting against the door, listening for any sound that might indicate James was trying to enter. The physical confrontation had crossed a line, and she knew that staying any longer would put her in serious danger. The next morning, Sarah called Maria from the diner during her lunch break, using the restaurant's phone to avoid James's monitoring. Maria had good news. The women's shelter had space available, and they were willing to provide transportation to pick Sarah up from a safe location. The plan would need to be executed within the next few days. Before James became suspicious about Sarah's increased anxiety and secretive behavior, Maria suggested that Sarah leave during the day while James was working in the far pasture with the cattle. She could pack a small bag with essentials and meet Maria at the school, where the shelter's van would pick her up. The timing would need to be perfect, and Sarah would have to leave without saying goodbye to Emma and Michael, which broke her heart. The hardest part of the plan was accepting that she would be leaving the children in a potentially dangerous situation. Sarah agonized over this decision, but Maria helped her understand that staying would not protect them and might actually put them at greater risk if James's behavior continued to escalate. The best thing Sarah could do for Emma and Michael was to get herself to safety and then work with authorities to ensure their well-being. Sarah spent her last few days at the ranch trying to act normally while secretly preparing for her escape. She hid a small bag of clothes and personal items in the barn, where she could grab it quickly when the time came. She also made copies of important documents and tucked them into her jacket pocket. The night before her planned departure, Sarah looked in on Emma and Michael as they slept. Knowing it might be the last time she would see them, she whispered quiet apologies and promises that she would find a way to help them from wherever she ended up. The children had become the closest thing to family she had ever known, and leaving them felt like abandoning her own siblings. James seemed to sense that something was different about Sarah's behavior, and he watched her more closely than usual. During breakfast, he announced that he would be staying close to the house that day, instead of working in the distant fields. The change in his routine threatened to derail Sarah's escape plan, and she felt panic rising in her chest as she realized she might have to postpone her departure again. But fate intervened when a neighbor called about a fence break that was allowing James's cattle to wander onto the main road. The emergency required James's immediate attention and would likely keep him busy for several hours. Sarah knew this might be her only chance, and she prepared to take the most important risk of her young life. The morning of Sarah's escape dawned clear and cold, with a crispness in the air that seemed to sharpen every sound and sensation. She watched from the kitchen window as James loaded his truck with fence repair supplies, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he would hear it. Emma and Michael sat at the table eating cereal, completely unaware that their world was about to change forever. James kissed the children goodbye and paused at Sarah's side, his hand lingering on her shoulder longer than necessary. He reminded her to keep the doors locked while he was gone, and mentioned that he would be back before lunch. The casual possessiveness in his voice made her skin crawl, but she managed to nod and smile like nothing was wrong. After James's truck disappeared down the gravel road, Sarah waited another 10 minutes to make sure he wouldn't return for forgotten tools or supplies. The children were absorbed in their morning cartoons, giving her a few precious moments to finalize her preparations. She told them she was going to check on the horses and would be back soon, hating herself for the lie but knowing it was necessary. In the barn, Sarah retrieved her hidden bag and quickly changed into the clothes she had selected for traveling. She had chosen practical items that would be warm and comfortable for the long journey ahead. Her hands shook as she packed the last few essentials, including the journal that documented James's inappropriate behavior. The sound of a car engine made Sarah freeze in terror, thinking James had returned early. But when she peered out of the barn, she saw Maria's familiar sedan pulling into the driveway. The teacher had come to personally ensure Sarah's safe departure, knowing how frightened and vulnerable the young woman was feeling. Maria quickly assessed the situation and helped Sarah load her bag into the car. She had brought a note to leave for the children, explaining that Sarah had to go away unexpectedly but that she cared about them very much. It wasn't much, but it was better than disappearing without any explanation at all. The hardest moment came when Sarah had to go back into the house to leave the note and say a silent goodbye to Emma and Michael. They were still watching television, Emma curled up with her favorite stuffed animal and Michael sprawled on the floor with his coloring books. Sarah wanted to hug them and explain everything, but she knew that would only make the situation more dangerous for everyone involved. She placed the note on the kitchen counter where the children would find it easily, then took one last look around the house that had been both a sanctuary and a prison. The photos on the mantel showed James with his late wife and children, all smiling and happy in simpler times. Sarah wondered if Linda had ever seen the darkness that lurked beneath her husband's caring facade. The drive to the reservation school felt like the longest 10 minutes of Sarah's life. Every shadow and sound made her think James had discovered her escape and was pursuing them. Maria kept up a steady stream of reassuring conversation, but Sarah could barely focus on the words through her overwhelming anxiety and guilt about leaving the children. At the school, the women's shelter van was already waiting, driven by a kind-faced woman named Janet, who specialized in helping young women escape dangerous situations. Janet's calm professionalism was exactly what Sarah needed in that moment of transition. She helped Sarah transfer her belongings and provided information about what to expect during the journey. And at the shelter, Maria hugged Sarah goodbye and promised to keep an eye on Emma and Michael from a distance. She assured Sarah that if she noticed any signs that the children were being harmed or neglected, she would contact the appropriate authorities immediately. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best they could manage under the circumstances. The van pulled away from the reservation as Sarah watched through the rear window, seeing her temporary home disappear behind trees and hills. She felt a mixture of relief and overwhelming sadness, knowing she was finally safe but also leaving behind the only stable family situation she had ever experienced, even though it had become corrupted by James's inappropriate desires. During the 4-hour drive to the state capitol, Janet shared information about the shelter's programs and helped Sarah understand her options for moving forward. The facility offered temporary housing, job training, counseling services, and assistance with finding permanent housing and employment. For the first time in months, Sarah began to believe that she might have a real future ahead of her. The conversation also revealed that Sarah's situation was unfortunately not unique. Janet had helped dozens of young women escape similar circumstances, often involving older men who preyed on vulnerable girls aging out of the foster care system. The pattern was depressingly familiar: isolation, gradual escalation of inappropriate behavior, and threats or manipulation to maintain control. When they arrived at the shelter, Sarah was struck by how normal and welcoming it looked. She had imagined something institutional and depressing, but the building was warm and homelike, with comfortable furniture and cheerful decorations. The other residents she met were women of various ages, who had escaped different types of dangerous situations, but they all shared a common understanding of what it meant to start over from nothing. Sarah's intake process was thorough, but respectful, focusing on her immediate needs for safety, food, and rest. The counselor who interviewed her was skilled at helping trauma survivors tell their stories without being re-traumatized by the process. For the first time, Sarah felt like someone in authority was taking her experience seriously and treating her as a victim rather than a problem to be solved. That first night in the shelter, Sarah lay in a narrow but clean bed in a room she shared with another young woman named Crystal, who had escaped an abusive marriage. The sounds of the city outside were foreign after months of country silence, but somehow the urban noise felt safer than the isolation of the ranch. She was finally in a place where James couldn't reach her, but Sarah's relief was tempered by constant worry about Emma and Michael. She couldn't stop thinking about how they would react to finding her note, how James would explain her sudden departure, and whether her leaving would somehow make their lives worse. The guilt was almost overwhelming, even though she knew logically that staying would have helped no one. The next morning brought devastating news. Maria called the shelter to report that James had contacted the tribal police, claiming that Sarah had stolen money and personal items when she left the ranch. He was painting himself as the victim of an ungrateful young woman who had taken advantage of his generosity and kindness. The story was believable because it played into existing stereotypes about foster children and troubled youth. Even worse, James was demanding that Sarah be returned to face charges for theft. The tribal police were taking his claims seriously because of his standing in the community and the lack of any evidence to support Sarah's allegations about his inappropriate behavior. Maria was doing her best to advocate for Sarah, but she was fighting against a well-established narrative that painted James as a grieving widower and devoted father. The shelter's legal advocate explained to Sarah that she was safe from being forcibly returned to the reservation, but that the theft allegations could follow her and make it difficult to find employment or housing in the future. James's false accusations were a calculated attempt to destroy her credibility and force her to return to his control. Sarah realized that escaping from James physically had been only the first step in a much longer battle. He was using his position in the community and his skills at manipulation to continue controlling her life from a distance. The man who had once seemed like a caring father figure had revealed himself to be a predator willing to destroy her reputation and future to maintain his power over her. As Sarah settled into the shelter's routine of counseling sessions, job training workshops, and group meetings with other survivors, she began to understand the true scope of what she had escaped. The counselors helped her recognize the grooming behavior she had experienced and understand that none of it had been her fault. For the first time in her life, Sarah began to believe that she deserved safety, respect, and the chance to build a life on her own terms. But even as she worked toward healing and independence, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her story with James was far from over. His false accusations and attempts to damage her reputation suggested that he wasn't willing to simply let her go. The secret he was hiding about his true nature was something he would fight desperately to protect, and Sarah feared that her escape had only escalated a dangerous game she didn't fully understand yet. 3 months after arriving at the shelter, Sarah had begun to build a new life for herself in the city. She had found a job at a small bookstore cafe, enrolled in evening classes at the community college, and moved into a shared apartment with 2 other young women. For the first time in her life, she was experiencing what it felt like to make her own choices and control her own destiny. But the peace she had found was shattered when Crystal, her former roommate at the shelter, approached her with disturbing news. Crystal had been following the local news from the reservation, and a story had emerged that made Sarah's blood run cold. A teenage girl named Jessica Winters had gone missing from a neighboring ranch, and some community members were suggesting she might have run away like Sarah had. The details were eerily familiar. Jessica was 17, had been living with a foster family, and had recently started helping James Crowfeather with ranch work after school. The girl's foster parents described her as responsible and hardworking, not the type to disappear without explanation. But James was telling people that Jessica had seemed troubled lately and had talked about wanting to leave the reservation. Sarah immediately recognized the pattern. James had found another vulnerable young woman to target, someone even younger and more powerless than Sarah had been. The realization filled her with guilt and terror. Had her escape simply caused James to find a new victim? Was Jessica experiencing the same manipulation and threats that Sarah had endured? Through Maria, who was still teaching at the reservation school, Sarah learned more disturbing details about Jessica's situation. The girl had been working at James's ranch for only 6 weeks before she disappeared. During that time, several people had noticed that James seemed very interested in Jessica's welfare, offering her rides to town and bringing her small gifts, just as he had done with Sarah. Even more troubling, Emma and Michael Crowfeather had mentioned to their teacher that their father had been talking about Jessica a lot, comparing her favorably to Sarah, and suggesting that she might be able to help fill the gap that Sarah's departure had left in their household. The children innocently repeated conversations that revealed James's disturbing focus on replacing Sarah with another young woman. Sarah knew she had to do something, but she felt powerless and terrified. Her accusations against James had been dismissed when she left the reservation, and his theft allegations against her were still hanging over her head. Who would believe her now, especially when she was trying to help a girl who might be dead or hidden somewhere beyond help? The decision was made for her when Jessica's body was found in a remote canyon about 20 miles from the reservation. The initial police investigation determined that she had died from a fall, apparently while hiking alone. But Sarah knew it wasn't an accident. James had escalated from harassment and threats to murder, and Jessica had paid the price for Sarah's escape. Sarah contacted the state police and told them everything she knew about James's pattern of behavior with vulnerable young women. She provided her journal documenting his inappropriate conduct, shared details about his possessive and controlling nature, and explained how Jessica's situation mirrored her own experience. The detective who interviewed her was thorough and professional, but Sarah could see skepticism in his eyes. The challenge was that Sarah had no physical evidence of James's involvement in Jessica's death. and her credibility was damaged by his theft allegations. The detective explained that without witnesses or forensic evidence, it would be nearly impossible to prove that Jessica's death was anything other than a tragic accident. James's reputation as a devoted father and community member worked in his favor, but Sarah's report did prompt the police to take a closer look at James's background and recent activities. What they discovered was deeply troubling. Over the past 5 years, 3 other young women had disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances after having contact with James Crowfeather. The pattern had been overlooked because the incidents occurred over several years and involved transient populations like foster, children, and seasonal workers. The investigation revealed that James had a history of offering help and housing to vulnerable young women, always presenting himself as a good Samaritan, trying to make a difference in their lives. But several of these women had later disappeared or died in ways that were ruled accidental, but seemed suspicious when viewed as part of a larger pattern. One case involved a 19-year-old named Amy Rodriguez, who had been found drowned in a local river after working at James's ranch for 2 months. Another concerned a 20-year-old foster care graduate named Tina Bearclaw, who had allegedly committed suicide by jumping from a bridge, despite having no history of mental illness and having recently received a scholarship to attend college. The most chilling discovery was that James had taken photographs of all these women, just as he had done with Sarah. When police executed a search warrant on his property, they found hundreds of pictures hidden throughout the house, documenting the lives and activities of his victims in disturbing detail. Some of the photos showed the women in states of distress or fear, suggesting they were aware of the danger they faced. Detective Morrison, who was leading the investigation, called Sarah to inform her about the search results. He apologized for initially doubting her story and explained how her report had been the key to uncovering what appeared to be a serial killing pattern spanning several years. Without Sarah's courage in coming forward, James might have continued targeting vulnerable young women indefinitely. The evidence was mounting, but building a prosecutable case remained challenging. James was a smart and careful predator who had chosen victims that society was likely to overlook or dismiss. Foster children, young women aging out of the system, and seasonal workers were populations that often disappeared without generating much attention or investigation. James seemed to understand that the investigation was closing in on him. He hired an expensive lawyer from the state capitol and began a public relations campaign to maintain his image as a grieving widower and devoted father. He claimed that the police investigation was harassment based on false accusations from a troubled young woman who had stolen from him. The community was divided in their response to the allegations. Some people had always found James's interest in helping young women suspicious, while others couldn't believe that a man who was so good with his children could be capable of such horrible crimes. The tribal council found itself in the difficult position of trying to balance support for law enforcement with loyalty to a longtime community member. Emma and Michael Crowfeather were placed in protective custody with their grandmother while the investigation continued. Sarah's heart broke when she learned about the children's situation, knowing how confused and traumatized they must be by the accusations against their father. She wanted to reach out to them somehow, but her lawyer advised against any contact that might complicate the criminal case. As the investigation expanded, more victims began to come forward. Women who had survived encounters with James but had been too afraid or ashamed to report them found the courage to speak out. Their stories painted a picture of a man who used his reputation and position in the community to gain access to vulnerable women, then systematically groomed and abused them. One of the most powerful testimonies came from Rebecca Thompson, a former ranch hand who had worked for James 3 years earlier. She described how he had gradually isolated her from friends and family, convinced her that no one else would believe or care about her experiences, and threatened to destroy her life if she spoke out against him. Rebecca had eventually escaped by stealing money from James and fleeing in the middle of the night, but she had lived in fear of his retaliation ever since. The psychological profile that emerged from these testimonies was that of a sophisticated predator who understood how to exploit the vulnerabilities of young women who had been failed by the system. James targeted women who had no family support, limited resources, and histories of trauma that made them less likely to be believed if they reported abuse. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic psychologist who consulted on the case, explained to the investigation team how predators like James often maintained dual personalities. They could be genuinely caring and protective in some relationships while being manipulative and dangerous in others. This ability to compartmentalize their behavior made them particularly effective at maintaining their public image while carrying out their crimes. The breakthrough in the case came when forensic investigators found physical evidence linking James to Jessica Winter's death. Fibers from his jacket were discovered on Jessica's clothing, and GPS data from his truck showed that he had been in the area where her body was found on the day she disappeared. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling when combined with the pattern of behavior documented by Sarah and other survivors. James was arrested on charges of murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault related to multiple victims. The arrest sent shockwaves through the reservation community, where many people struggled to reconcile the caring father and community member they knew with the monster described in the police reports. Sarah watched the news coverage of James's arrest from her apartment in the city, feeling a mixture of relief and overwhelming emotion. She had spent months wondering if she had done the right thing by escaping, if she could have somehow protected Jessica and the other victims. Now she understood that her courage in speaking out had been essential to stopping a dangerous predator. But Sarah also knew that the legal battle was far from over. James's lawyer was already preparing a defense that would likely involve attacking the credibility of his accusers and arguing that the deaths were coincidental tragedies rather than deliberate murders. The trial would force Sarah and the other survivors to relive their traumatic experiences in public, facing cross-examination designed to make them appear unreliable or vengeful. As Sarah prepared herself for the challenges ahead, she drew strength from the knowledge that she was no longer the powerless 18-year-old who had been trapped on that ranch. She had built a life for herself, found her voice, and learned to trust her own instincts. Whatever James and his lawyers threw at her, she would face it with the support of other survivors and the determination to ensure that justice was finally served for Jessica and all the other women who hadn't been able to escape his predatory behavior. The trial of James Crowfeather became the most closely watched criminal case in the state's recent history. Media outlets from across the country descended on the small courthouse, drawn by the story of a respected community leader accused of being a serial killer who targeted vulnerable young women. Sarah found herself at the center of a media storm that felt almost as overwhelming as the original trauma she had experienced. James's defense team, led by renowned criminal attorney Marcus Blackwood, had crafted a strategy designed to destroy the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses. They painted Sarah and the other survivors as troubled young women with histories of mental illness, substance abuse, and criminal behavior who were conspiring to destroy an innocent man's reputation for financial gain. The defense argued that James was actually a victim himself, a grieving widower who had tried to help disadvantaged women out of genuine compassion, only to be repaid with false accusations and extortion attempts. They portrayed the deaths as tragic coincidences, pointing out that young women in foster care and transitional situations had higher rates of suicide and accidental death than the general population. Sarah's testimony was scheduled for the third week of the trial, giving her time to observe the proceedings and understand the defense strategy. She watched from the gallery as other survivors took the stand, admiring their courage while also seeing how the defense attorneys tried to tear apart their stories through aggressive cross-examination. Rebecca Thompson's testimony was particularly difficult to watch. The defense attorney grilled her about her history of drug use, her criminal record for minor theft, and her failure to report James's alleged abuse for 3 years. By the time the cross-examination was finished, Rebecca was in tears, and Sarah could see doubt creeping into some of the jurors' faces. But the prosecution, led by District Attorney Linda Martinez, had prepared carefully for the defense's tactics. They presented expert testimony about trauma responses, explaining why victims of sexual predators often delay reporting and may engage in seemingly irrational behaviors like returning to their abusers or failing to seek help immediately. Dr. Patricia Williams, a specialist in trauma psychology, testified about the complex dynamics of predatory relationships and how skilled manipulators like James could convince their victims that they were complicit in their own abuse. Her testimony helped the jury understand why intelligent, capable women might remain in dangerous situations or struggle to articulate their experiences coherently. The forensic evidence was crucial to the prosecution's case. The fibers found on Jessica Winter's clothing, the GPS data placing James at the scene, and the collection of photographs discovered in his home painted a picture of a man who was obsessed with controlling and documenting his victims' lives. The photographs, in particular, were deeply disturbing because they showed a level of premeditation and planning that contradicted the defense's portrayal of James as a spontaneous helper. When Sarah finally took the stand, she had prepared extensively with the prosecution team and victim advocates. She wore a simple navy dress and spoke clearly and calmly, determined not to let James's defense team rattle her into appearing unstable or vengeful. She had practiced telling her story dozens of times, learning to focus on facts rather than emotions. Sarah's testimony lasted for 2 full days. She methodically described her arrival at the ranch, the gradual escalation of James's inappropriate behavior, the isolation and fear she had experienced, and her eventual escape. She presented her hidden journal as evidence, reading entries that documented specific incidents of harassment and threats. The defense's cross-examination was brutal. Attorney Blackwood questioned every detail of Sarah's story, pointing out minor inconsistencies between her testimony and her original police statement. He suggested that Sarah had fabricated the journal entries after Jessica's death to support her false accusations. He brought up the theft allegations James had made, implying that Sarah was a dishonest person seeking revenge and financial compensation. But Sarah had learned to trust herself and her experiences. When Blackwood tried to confuse her with rapid-fire questions about dates and times, she calmly admitted when she couldn't remember specific details while maintaining that her overall account was accurate. When he suggested she had misinterpreted James's friendly gestures, she looked directly at the jury and explained how she had learned to recognize predatory behavior through years in the foster care system. The most powerful moment of Sarah's testimony came when Blackwood asked her why she hadn't reported James's behavior to authorities while she was living at the ranch. Sarah's answer was simple and devastating. Because I had nowhere else to go, and I knew that people like you would find ways to make it my fault. The prosecution's closing argument tied together all the evidence and testimony to paint a comprehensive picture of James's predatory pattern. They argued that his selection of vulnerable victims, his careful grooming process, and his escalation to murder when victims tried to escape demonstrated a sophisticated and dangerous criminal mind that had operated successfully for years. District Attorney Martinez reminded the jury that the defense's strategy of attacking the victims was itself evidence of how predators operated. She pointed out that James had specifically chosen women who would be easy to discredit, knowing that their backgrounds and circumstances would make them less likely to be believed if they came forward. The defense's closing argument focused on reasonable doubt, arguing that the prosecution had failed to prove their case beyond the high standard required for criminal conviction. Blackwood emphasized the lack of physical evidence, directly linking James to most of the alleged crimes, and suggested that the similarities between the cases could be explained by the common challenges faced by young women aging out of the foster care system. The jury deliberated for 3 days, during which Sarah barely slept or ate. She had invested everything in seeking justice for Jessica and the other victims, and the possibility that James might be acquitted was almost unbearable. The other survivors gathered together in a hotel conference room, supporting each other through the agonizing wait. When the jury finally returned with their verdict, the courtroom was packed with reporters, community members, and advocates. Sarah sat in the front row with the other survivors, holding Rebecca's hand as the foreman read the verdict aloud. James was found guilty on multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault, but acquitted on some of the older charges where the evidence was less conclusive. The guilty verdict brought a mixture of relief and vindication for Sarah, but also a profound sadness for all the lives that had been lost or damaged by James's actions. She thought about Jessica Winters, who would never get to experience the freedom and independence that Sarah had fought so hard to achieve. She thought about Emma and Michael, who would grow up knowing that their father was a monster. During the sentencing phase, Sarah and several other survivors were allowed to present victim impact statements. Sarah spoke about the long-term effects of James's abuse, the difficulty of learning to trust people and form healthy relationships, and the guilt she carried about the women who had died after her escape. But she also talked about her determination to build a meaningful life and help other young women avoid similar victimization. James was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, bringing an official end to his predatory career. As the bailiffs led him away, Sarah noticed that he looked directly at her with an expression that seemed to contain both hatred and grudging respect. She realized that he finally understood that she was no longer the powerless girl he had tried to control and abuse. After the trial, Sarah returned to her life in the city, but she was forever changed by the experience. She had found her voice and learned to use it effectively, not just for herself but for other vulnerable women who needed someone to speak up for them. The trial had been traumatic, but it had also been empowering, proving to Sarah that justice was possible even for victims who seemed to have no power or voice in society. The conviction also led to broader changes in how law enforcement and social services approached cases involving vulnerable young women. Sarah's case became a model for recognizing and investigating predatory patterns, and training programs were developed to help professionals identify and respond to similar situations more effectively. 5 years after James Crowfeather's conviction, Sarah Jenkins had transformed from a frightened foster child into a confident advocate for vulnerable youth. She had completed her college degree in social work and was pursuing a master's degree in victim advocacy while working for a nonprofit organization that helped young women aging out of the foster care system. The organization, called New Horizons, had been inspired partly by Sarah's story and her determination to prevent other young women from falling victim to predators like James. Sarah's role involved training social workers, law enforcement officers, and community members to recognize the warning signs of predatory behavior and respond appropriately when vulnerable individuals were at risk. Sarah had also become a powerful public speaker, sharing her story at conferences and training sessions across the country. Her presentations were carefully crafted to educate audiences about the tactics used by predators, while also highlighting the resilience and strength of survivors. She had learned to tell her story without being re-traumatized by it, using her experience as a tool for education and prevention. The success of her advocacy work had brought Sarah a sense of purpose and healing that she had never expected to find. She had discovered that helping other people navigate similar challenges was therapeutic for her own ongoing recovery. The powerlessness she had felt as James's victim had been transformed into empowerment through her ability to help others avoid or escape similar situations. But Sarah's journey toward complete healing received an unexpected catalyst when she learned that Emma and Michael Crowfeather, now 13 and 15 years old, wanted to meet with her. The siblings had been living with their maternal grandmother since their father's arrest, and they had undergone extensive therapy to help them process the trauma of learning about James's crimes. Their therapist, Dr. Karen Moss, contacted Sarah to explain that the children had many questions about their father and their childhood that only Sarah could answer. They remembered her fondly from their time together and wanted to understand why she had left so suddenly and what their father had really been like during that period. Sarah agreed to meet with Emma and Michael. Though she was nervous about how the encounter would affect all of them, she prepared carefully with her own therapist, Dr. Amanda Foster, who had been helping her work through the complex emotions surrounding her escape from the ranch and its aftermath. The meeting took place in Dr. Moss's office, a comfortable space designed to feel safe and non-threatening. Emma and Michael had grown significantly in the 5 years since Sarah had last seen them, but they were still recognizably the children she had cared for and worried about during her time at the ranch. Emma, now a thoughtful teenager, asked Sarah directly why she had left without saying goodbye. Sarah explained in age-appropriate terms that their father had been making her feel unsafe and that she had needed to leave quickly for her own protection. She emphasized that leaving them had been the hardest part of her decision and that she had worried about them constantly. Michael, who was struggling more with anger about his father's crimes, wanted to know if James had ever hurt Sarah physically. Sarah answered honestly but carefully, explaining that their father had threatened her and made her feel scared, but that she had been able to get away before anything worse happened. She made it clear that James's behavior toward her was completely different from how he had treated them as his children. The most difficult part of the conversation came when Emma asked if Sarah thought their father could have hurt them too if she had stayed. Sarah worked carefully to balance honesty with reassurance, explaining that predators, like their father, typically targeted specific types of people and that his focus on vulnerable young women didn't necessarily mean he would have harmed his own children. But Sarah also validated their fears and confusion about having a father who could appear loving and caring, while also being capable of terrible crimes. She explained that this contradiction was common among predators, who often maintained completely different personalities in different relationships. Over several sessions, Sarah helped Emma and Michael understand that their father's crimes were not a reflection of anything they had done wrong, or any failure on their part to recognize his true nature. She emphasized that children were not responsible for their parents' actions and that they could still have positive memories of their childhood while acknowledging the reality of what their father had done. The healing process was beneficial for all three of them. Emma and Michael were able to get answers to questions that had been haunting them for years, while Sarah was able to see that the children she had cared about were growing into strong, resilient young people despite the trauma they had experienced. Through her work with Emma and Michael, Sarah also learned more about what had happened at the ranch after her departure. The children remembered their father being angry and withdrawn for weeks after Sarah left, and they recalled him making harsh comments about ungrateful people who didn't appreciate kindness. This information helped Sarah understand that her escape had indeed protected her from escalating abuse. Sarah's relationship with Emma and Michael evolved into an ongoing connection that provided healing and growth for all of them. She became a trusted adult in their lives, someone who understood their unique experience and could help them navigate the complex emotions surrounding their father's crimes. As word spread about Sarah's advocacy, work, and her success in helping other survivors, she began receiving invitations to consult on high-profile cases involving predatory behavior. Law enforcement agencies sought her input on investigation strategies, and prosecutors asked for her help in preparing victims to testify effectively. One particularly significant case involved a teacher who had been grooming and abusing students for over a decade. Sarah's experience and expertise helped investigators understand the psychological dynamics involved and develop strategies for encouraging other victims to come forward. The case resulted in multiple convictions and led to improved safeguarding policies in schools across several states. Sarah also became involved in legislative advocacy, working with lawmakers to strengthen protections for young people aging out of foster care and improve training requirements for adults who work with vulnerable populations. Her first-hand experience with the system's failures gave her credibility and passion that resonated with both legislators and the public. The culmination of Sarah's advocacy work came when she was invited to establish a new program at the state university focused on training future social workers to recognize and respond to predatory behavior. The Sarah Jenkins Center for Victim Advocacy became a leading institution for research and education on protecting vulnerable populations. As Sarah stood before her first class of graduate students, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her from a terrified 18-year-old with nowhere to go to a respected professional with the power to change lives. She thought about Jessica Winters and the other women who hadn't survived their encounters with predators, knowing that their memories continued to drive her work toward preventing similar tragedies. The secret that James Crowfeather had tried so desperately to hide had ultimately become the foundation for Sarah's life's work. His predatory behavior, revealed through her courage and the courage of other survivors, had led to improved protections for countless vulnerable young people. The very shame and powerlessness he had tried to impose on his victims had been transformed into strength, advocacy, and hope for a safer future. Sarah's story had become proof that survivors could not only heal from their trauma, but could also use their experiences to create meaningful change in the world. The frightened girl who had once felt trapped and voiceless had found her power, and was using it to ensure that other young women would never have to face such danger alone and unprotected. In quiet moments, Sarah sometimes thought about the ranch where her nightmare had begun, and where her journey toward empowerment had started. She hoped that Emma and Michael would continue to heal and grow, carrying forward the love and stability their grandmother provided while learning to trust their own instincts about safety and relationships. The legacy of James Crowfeather's crimes would always include the pain and loss he had caused, but it would also include the strength and resilience of the women who had survived him and the systemic changes that their courage had made possible. For Sarah, that transformation of darkness into light represented the most powerful form of justice she could imagine.